Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions you have during the presentation. If we're unable to get to them during the presentation, we'll answer them at the end. My name is Braden Knutson, and I will be your host for this webinar. Today we will be pleased to hear from Burke Jackson, who will be speaking on making sense of the census. Burke Jackson retired from BYU over 3 years ago after teaching for 40 years at the Marriott School of Business. 2 years ago, him and his wife became church service missionaries in family history at the Family History Training Center in Orem, where he taught 2 different sessions as part of the 5-day course. He and his wife are joining the BYU Family History Library as missionaries part-time.
Okay, as mentioned, the topic is making sense of the census. Excuse my spelling. And our goal is to help you become like the following people. So I'm going to put up some pictures of people, and I want you to, in your mind, identify them and think about any classic phrases that they used. It will help if you're old and you watch a lot of TV like I did. So here we go. We want you to become like your friend Dick Tracy. Now, he was a comic strip guy, if you don't know him, started in 1931. And notice that he's wearing an Apple Watch, even as early as the 1950s. We want you to become like our friend Joe Friday from Dragnet. And his classic phrase was, I pause for you to think about it, was just the facts, ma'am. So when we do this census searching and we do family history, we want to get the facts out as much as possible as we go about this process. This is, you may recall, is Kojak. And Kojak's famous, this is a bit of a stretch, Kojak's famous line was, "Who loves you, baby?" And to relate this to family history is a bit of a stretch, but the people on the other side of the veil will love you, baby, as you do this, as you search and learn more about them. And this is Columbo, right? You should recognize him, some of you. And his famous line, he would be interviewing people who were guilty, and as he was leaving, he, in his rumpled raincoat, he would turn back and say, "Just one more thing." So that's a bit of what happens when we're doing this work with census record and we're trying to make sense of the census. We want to find the one more thing that gives us the facts as we're trying to discover about our ancestors. This is Hercule Poirot, another famous detective, and his famous line has to do with the little gray cells. So I have a quote from him. "It is the brain, the little gray cells, on which one must rely. One must seek the truth within, not without." So as you do this, use your brain. I guess that's the bottom line. And here's Miss Marple, and I don't know if she had a famous phrase or not, but she's someone you might recognize. There have been several Miss Marples, and she's one of them. And this, for your more modern TV watchers, this is Kate Beckett from Castle, and I don't know whether she has a famous line or not, but she's a good detective. And finally, this is one of the many Sherlock, not finally, but second last, one of the main famous Sherlock Holmes characters. And of course, his famous line was, "Elementary, my dear Watson." So at the end of the day, we want facts, we want the one more thing, we want to use our brain, and we want to get to the point where we say this information is true, it's elementary, my dear Watson. But finally, maybe my favorite, and this, I could be singing this, da-dum, 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 da-dum. And there's Inspector Clouseau. All right, that's who we want you to become like, detectives, because that's what this work is about. Looking for clues, finding things that fit together that allow you to learn something about your ancestors. Okay, so we're going to do some census CSI, census searching and investigating. And we're going to find where our ancestors live. That's what you can do in the census. You can follow the family over time. You can determine relationships. Those are pretty accurate. And you can discover clues for other records through census searching and investigating. So our suspect for the beginning of this presentation will be Anne Boston. What we know about her at the beginning is that she was born about 1834, that she lived in Michigan, and she's married. It's not there, but we do know that. And our goal is to learn about Anne's life and family as we look through several census records over time, over about a 50-year period with Anne. And we're going to keep track of what we learn by looking at a family group sheet. And at the beginning, all we have is that the father is Boston, the mother is Anne, and the mother was born about 1834. And we're going to learn about her family over time. We're going to start with family search, where the first two census records. By the way, what's the plural of census? It's censuses, but it maybe shouldn't be. It should be censi or censuses, something weird, but censuses. But the first two we're going to look at is in family search. We're going to start with the 1870 census. And going into family search, this is where we find the homepage. We look under search and we look at records. We click on records and it takes us to a page of records where we're going to put in Anne Boston. And all we're going to do is restrict the records by location because we know she was in Michigan. And we're going to restrict it by type. And we're going to say, all right, we want to look at census records. Notice we didn't even put in what we thought her birthday was. We're just going to start with a location and a census record and search. And this is what we get. So you'll see we have Anne Boston in Michigan, and we get 262 results. And as usual, the first results often are the ones that are the most meaningful, but you sometimes have to search through more than the first ones. But in this case, we see Anne Boston. We see some that look, we could refine our search, by the way, by putting in her birthday, but it looks like we maybe don't need to. We have two Anne Bostons. Remember, we're looking in the 1870 census. So we have two Anne Bostons. And if you look at the right, you see kind of the same family, Thomas, Anne, and Jane. One's born from 1833 to 1834, and the other one from 1868 to 1869. But they're living in the same place and seem to have the same family structure. So our speculation, if you're detectives, this is the easy part. You can say, looks like one's the mom and one's the daughter. And if we look at the documents, the index records, you see some of that same information. So we have Anne, who's 36 as of the 1870 census, and we have Anne, who's 1 year old. So we're speculating that's a daughter, all right? But we're looking at the mom. So we're going to look at the mom's record in 1870, and we see here she is. Here's the information. We say she's 36 years old, which would mean she was born about 1834, which is what we thought when we started this process. And we can see her family. Thomas is the husband. He's 5 years older. And then we have Anne, who's 1. And then we have Janie Watson. Now, who's Janie Watson? If you're a detective, you say, well, Janie Watson is, if you look at it, she's from the same place as the dad, England, at least same country. So she may be a relative of some kind, or she may be a nanny or something like that. We're not sure. So we could copy and print this if we wanted to, just to keep it in our records. Here's where the collection is, the 1870 census. We could attach it to family tree, which we want to do as we find sources. But we're going to look at the document. And there's the document. And we notice what image it is, because it's always good to know the image in case you have to go to a previous image or an image after that if you're at the beginning or the end of the page. And that happens in this case. So we can blow it up, we can get bigger, and we see where the census was taken. It was taken in the city of Pontiac in the 2nd Ward, and this is where I make an LDS joke that it's in the 2nd Ward in 1870, but it means district, as many of you know. So where else is it? It was done. That's an interesting thing, is to look where it was done, when it was done. It was done the 22nd day of August, 1870, and that may help if you're trying to find an estimated birth date at some point. And then we see the columns or the headings at the top. It turns out that every census record has subtly different headings at the top. They do the basics, names, ages, married, sometimes birthdays, but they have different headings at the top, which you'll find out. So we'll look at these in detail, a little detail. So you see at the left, there's the dwelling house, and then the name of the person, and the place of abode on the first day of June in 1870. And then you get age, sex, color, profession, value of real estate, that didn't always happen, value of personal property, place of birth. So we get a lot of interesting information. This is a good census for information. Parentage, and what it says about parentage is whether they were foreign born or not. And then one of my favorite, wait, I'm going to go back to that. One of my favorite headings is whether, and there are tick marks, whether they're deaf and dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic. And I don't want to say anything about deaf and dumb, blind, and insane, but I'm always wondering if my wife were answering and they asked some of those questions, would she say anything about it, whether there's an idiot in the home or not? But anyway, we'll move on. And so we'll find, and here we find Thomas and Anne and young Anne and Janie at the bottom of the page. And there they are. And we're going to get there in a little more detail in a minute. But we do want to look at the next page because they're at the bottom of the page. So if we look at the next page, we're looking at the top. We don't see anything. There are no more Bostons. So we're going to return to the first image and then see what we can learn. And there they are. What do we learn as detectives about this family? Thomas, we didn't know his name before. We know how old he is. We know he's a clerk. It's hard to read, but a clerk in the grocery store. She's keeping house. And we know they own some real estate. $3,000 of real estate and $2,000 of personal property. And he was born in England. She was born in Michigan. And Janie is a domestic servant. She could be a relative, but probably she's just somebody that was brought over like a nanny, as she was born in England as well. Okay, so we're ready to move on, and we're going to fill in our family group sheet with what we learned in the 1870 census. So we got Thomas. We know about when he was born. We know about when they were married because they have a 1-year-old in 1870. And we know there's a child, Anne. So we know some information. We move on, 1880 census. Now, how do we get there? We're in the 1870. We have to just go back. We'll see the index of the 1870, and we go to search results, and we're back on our page where we were earlier about Anne, where we found the 2 Anne Bostons. So if we look, 1880, there she is. By the way, we wouldn't have picked this if it weren't easy to find. But anyway, we have Anne, and it's the 1880 census. And there's the index record for the 1880 census. Now, as detectives, you should notice at least one thing here, a couple things. One is she's widowed. And so between 1870 and 1880, her husband died. Thomas died. We don't know when. And she has a son. That's new. She has a son named Fred, who was born 8 years earlier, so he wasn't in the previous census. And she has a daughter named Fanny. Now, if you were paying attention, the last daughter was named Anne. So the question is Fanny, Anne, are they the same person? We don't know that yet. It's possible they had an Anne who died and then she had a Fanny, but it's also possible that Anne, the daughter, went by Fanny. We'll move on and hope as detectives we find more information about that. And there's Fred, there's Fanny. And we can look at the document and see what that gives us, see if that tells us anything new. So there's Anne, Fanny, and Fred. You get the same information about where the people were born. And the other thing we get in this one, and a lot of census records, is we find out the location, where they live. So we find out they lived on Saginaw Street in Pontiac, Michigan. So maybe a place to Google or to go to or whatever if you're related to Anne Boston. So we've got more to put in the family group sheet. We've got the death of Thomas somewhere between 1870 and 1880. We've got where Anne's parents were born. That was part of that census. And I've put Fanny in, not sure whether Fanny and Anne are the same, and we put Fred in. So that's what we got about from the 1880 census. The 1890 census, many of you may know, was destroyed in fire, so we can't get any information off there for the Boston family. So we're going to move on to the 1900 census, and we're going to use Ancestry. We use Ancestry, we use them all. I think they all have a little different view and a little different indexing. So you may learn something from an Ancestry census that you can't learn from a family search census or Find My Past or My Heritage. They're all valuable in terms of looking at census records. So we will go to Ancestry. This may be slightly different than what the page looks like now, but it accomplishes the objective. So we're at Ancestry. You can sign in. I think you have to sign in to get to the census record. So username and password. And this is the page, the front page of Ancestry. So what we're looking for over on the bottom right is U.S. Census records. We click on that and we get the U.S. Federal Census collection page. We don't want to quite put in Anne Boston yet. What we want to do is go down to the bottom of the page, find the 1900 census, click on that, and now we're ready to search for Anne. So we're going to put in Anne Boston, Michigan, and the only other thing we did, and we probably don't have to do this, is to say she's a female and then search. And not surprisingly, we find her. She's at the top of the page, and that looks like her. Anne Boston. Notice that in the 1900 census, we're going to look at this in more detail, they actually give a birth date, a month and a year of a birthday. That's a nice census that gives you that. The other censuses just give ages. And you'll also notice that she's in the first ward. So they've probably had for the LDS people, a ward boundary change, and she's now in the first ward. All right, so we'll move on. We're going to view the record. And there she is. So if you're paying attention, in the 1880 census, she was 40. In the 1870 census, she was 36. So that's a good example of how ages are a bit, what's the right word? Suspicious. And I won't say a sexist joke here about how she only aged 4 years and 10, but this one, since it gives the month and year of the birth, then we're feeling a little more confident about her real age. And notice that in the last 20 years, she's aged 23. And the other thing that's interesting here, we'll highlight that in a minute. So let's see the record. Here's another index part of the record. That's where the citation is. Notice that it says that she has had 4 children and 2 are living. Now that's a data point for the detectives to think about that as we move forward. We only know about 2 children, or at least we know Fanny. Is it the same as Anne? And we know Fred. And it also gives you in the Ancestry some other records that might be interesting to look at. All right, so we're going to look at the record. And we can see that the date of birth is one of the headings that we saw with Anne. And we look at Anne, and there she is. And she's living by herself. Gives her birth year. It says the 4 children and 2 alive, and the other information about where her parents were born and where she was born. And notice that we now see that she lives on South Saginaw Street. Maybe the same place, but now they've identified it a little more in detail by calling it South Saginaw Street. All right, remember Fred? So here's mom in 1900, and there's a reason we're going to follow Fred for a minute. Um, there's Anne, what we just saw, and there's Fred in 1900. And if you look, Fred is the head of a family. Uh, he's got a wife and 2 children, and it says he had 2 and 2 are alive. But notice where they are. Fred's in the same place. He's in Oakland County, Pontiac Township, and a slightly different district number. So like we see with a lot of our ancestors, they stayed pretty much in the same location, and families often did as well. So we can fill in some more from 1900 in our family group sheet. We have a month and year that we feel a little bit more confident about. We have Fred when he was born. And if we follow Fred, just for a few more years, or 20 more years, in 1910, you see he's married again, has 4 children. And then in 1920, he's got 5 children. Now, the only thing I want you to sort of be detectives about is to look in 1920, and he's got his 2 youngest children are 14 and then 9. Okay, remember that. Fred's 2 youngest children. But by following Fred in the census record, we found Fred's marriage record. And that was a nice clue for his mother's maiden name. So here's Fred marrying Mary Miller. And if you notice, there's Anne and her husband Thomas, but there's Anne's maiden name of Smith. All right. So we've learned that from the 1900 census. We'll move on to Ancestry's 1910. Again, we go back to Ancestry, go to census records, click on the main page, but go down to the bottom to 1910. Then we put in our Ann, Boston, Michigan, a female, and search. And not surprisingly, she's at the top of the list again. We cheat about this, by the way. But anyway, so there's Anne. And this one did not have the month and year of birth, so it says about 1837, which we think is about right. And if we view the record, here's a little more detailed. Notice what's, as detectives, what do you see here that's new? We see Anne, she is 10 years older than she was 10 years ago, so we're getting more consistency about her age. But she's living with Fanny E. Boston. So that's Fanny. And Fanny's the right age. She's 40 for when we thought she was born. So we still don't know whether that's the same as the first Anne we saw as a child, but possibly. But the fact that we start to fill in this story, that Fanny's name is still Boston says one of 2 things. 1, she never married, or 2, she married and was divorced and took her maiden name, which happens occasionally. Even then, happened with my great-grandmother. Anyway, so we can look at this record, and there they are. There's Anne and Fanny. And as detectives, you should notice something, that on this census, it says that she had only 2 children and 2 are living. And that would be Fred and Fanny. So we're now getting confusing signals about how many children she really had. We'll come to that later. But we can finish our family group sheet. So we now know her maiden name is Ann Smith. We know something about Fred's wife, and that's about all additional we learned in that census. So what did we learn? We learned her husband's name, husband from England, approximate death date. We've got a 10-year period in which he died. He owned land. Anne was born in Michigan. Anne lived in Pontiac. Her parents were England. Anne's children, ages, and births, and we learned something about Fred and his family. What's next? We could look at marriage records, immigration records, Michigan death records, land tax records. These are all the next step after doing the census work. Local histories about Pontiac, UK vital records, because that's where her parents were born, Michigan records, and some more about Fred. All right. So we're through with Anne for a minute. We're going to come back to her at the very end. So here's some miscellaneous sort of census secrets. What can you learn from the census that's a little different than just name and age? We can get birthplaces of parents and family members. That's always nice to know, to get the history of our family. Number of children living. That can say that they maybe had a child in between censuses that was born and died. That's often something that occurs. Professions. So I'll ask you if you've had any interesting professions, those of you who have done this and gone on census records. Mine are relatively common. I have farmers, grocery clerks, seamstresses, what else? And just the kind of normal blue collar kinds of things. So I always wonder, do people have really interesting professions that they have found? Some of my missionary colleagues, one of them had a court justice, a Supreme Court justice in one of the states. Another one had a profession, S-period owner, which she found out to be a slave owner as a profession. So it's kind of fun to find interesting professions. So when you're in the chat room, you might say, hey, did you find any interesting professions as you've looked at census records of your children over time? All right, you can find the immigration year. That's not 100% accurate, but it does tell you some interesting things. I had a great-grandfather that came in 1881 from Scotland, but his wife and my grandmother, it said, came in 1883. And I actually think that's true. And that happened a lot, that people came, the husband or one of them came, usually the husband came, and then either went back and got the rest of the family or had the rest of the family come later. So immigration year is very interesting, and then you can search records and see when they really came by looking at some of the ship records. Unknown other spouses, that's happened, that you find. Neighbors, they're often family members, that's often happened. And I'm going to give you a personal. So Anne was not personal for me, just an interesting story. But I'm going to give you my first name is Burke. So I'm going to tell you about my great-grandfather's family and what I learned through the census about them. So here's a picture of my great-grandmother and her 7 children. She had 7, and they're all alive in this picture, and they're all somewhat adults. The youngest is my grandfather, William Burke, where I got my name from, my mother's maiden name. And so just note that they're all with their great-grandmother, their mother, at some point in their more adult life. But and that's their details page on Family Search. There are the 7 children. You can kind of see where they started being born in 1866, and then the last one, my grandfather, he was the youngest, in 1876. So in a 10-year period, they had 7 children. If we look at the 1870 census, there's my great-grandfather and great-grandmother and their 3 youngest children. Okay? I'll be detectives here as I show you the 1880 census. Remember that. 3 youngest children are with them in 1870. The 1880 census, what do you see? Well, there's my great-grandmother. She's taken her maiden name. I think it was not a happy divorce. Her brother's living with her, and my grandfather, the youngest of the 7, is living with her. We know they all lived to adult life, so the question is, what happened to the 6 other children? Well, the family story was that after the divorce, she couldn't afford to have them, so she farmed them all out and had them either work. So if we go back to the other census, so the oldest at this point is 14, so he's maybe old enough to go someplace and work, then 12, then 11, and then some really young. And she apparently farmed them out because she couldn't afford to have them. So I knew some of this, and my grandfather, in the end of the day, gets sent out at 7 to be on his own as well. So I went to the 1880 census and looked for one of the daughters. Her name was Ida Burke, and I found her, and she was living with a family called the Van Scowick family, and there she is. I'm sure it's her. It's in the same locality in Indiana. This is all in Indiana. And what was interesting was I sort of knew where she was, but I didn't know where her sister was. Living next door was a family, Ullery, and you had to go to the next page to see that one of the people living with the Ullery family was Ellen Burke. One of Ida's siblings was Helen Burke, but she was 6 years old in 1880. And so I felt this was kind of emotional for me. I sort of felt like, hey, I found two sisters who'd been sort of farmed out, but they were living next door to each other and were able to grow up together. And I hadn't found that out until this census. All right, so a little history of the U.S. Census. It was supposed to be for everybody. About 90% of U.S. citizens are listed, so your ancestors are probably there, most likely. It was done so we could figure out representation in the House of Representatives, taken every 10 years from 1790 to now, but they're not released until 72 years after it's taken. So the most recent census available is 1940. What? It had names, ages, relationships, residents. Those were almost in all of them. And then other information that varied per census. All right, so let's talk about, if we're detectives, about the evidence that we get from census. We have some very strong, solid evidence that we get. The residence is usually is accurate, even streets. Relationships are accurate, strong. Neighbors are accurate. Professions, I think, are really strong, solid evidence. The informative yet circumstantial, and many of you may have seen this, names are a little suspect, either because you can't read the writing or the census taker didn't hear it right or whatever. So names are a little tricky. Ages, as we've seen, are a little tricky, but close. Birthplaces are sometimes not always the same from census to census. And immigration years can be valuable, but it's not totally accurate. So here are some search strategies. Spelling of names. Try spelling every different way that you can think of. And if you can't think of that, use a wildcard search that substitutes a question mark for one letter or an asterisk for several letters. So for example, my great grandmother was a Kiefer, but Kiefer's been spelled all those different ways: K-A-F-E-R, K-A-E, K-E-I, K-I-E, and you can search using K asterisk F-E-R and it'll capture all those. So the wildcards can be very helpful. Use maiden name and married names for women to search. Search for other family members. Search for a child. Sometimes it's easier to find the child in the census or relatives in the census. And if you know the county and state, but just use the surname, and that may help. And as always, you can try the other websites. There's Family Search, Ancestry, MyHeritage, Find My Past, probably others, but those are the ones that we often use. All right, there are other census records around. There are state censuses. There are city directors, and there were special censuses taken in different years that talked about farms like agriculture 1850 to 1880 and how many workers are on the farms, where they were, etc. There were manufacturing information in special censuses in 1820 and then 1850 and 1880. Companies, number of employees, what they made, etc. And there was the one census in 1890 that had a special census about whether they were veterans or spouses of veterans that fought in the Civil War, probably mostly in the Union side, but that fought in the Civil War. And of course, there are other censuses around the world, at least the one that we often refer to as the UK census, that's been taken every 10 years starting in 1841 to 1911. So I'm going to go to one of those. So there's, in Find My Past, there's an 1851 census that has my great grandfather, William Ireland. And you'll notice that one of his children is Francis. That's my great grandfather. And that's the information you get. By the way, it didn't have the image, which you always liking it if you can see the image. But it says some things about where they were and what his occupation was. He was a farmer, agricultural laborer, 4 acres. And that's kind of fun. That's kind of fun to find. So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to go to that same census and Ancestry and see if there's anything different. And so there's Ancestry. And there's William, my great-great-great-grandfather. There's his wife. And then there's some things in there that weren't in the other one that about, what's the parish, what's their address. So, and then it gives you some hints for other census records in the UK. So the UK censuses are really nice. And this was in Scotland. And they do break it up by where it is, Scotland or England. All right, so that's all the census records. Now here's a pretty cool, I'll use that, that's my vernacular since I'm old. In today's day, it would be awesome, bad, sick, whatever, census tracking tool. And we've used Spencer Kimball to show you this tool. So this tool has, along the top, you see from 1790 to 1940, and then there are checks and magnifying glasses. And so if there's a check, that means you have put that source into your family search. It's been attached. If there's a magnifying glass, a detective glass, it means you haven't. And you can go to that one. Now notice 1890 doesn't have any checks, but there's some that wouldn't have checks. And if you were to check that through treeseek.com, you would be able to see what you have attached to your direct ancestors. That's just for direct ancestors. All right, finally, back to our suspect in Boston. So 4 children or 2. We've done some searching, and I'll tell you the results in a minute. And then the other question is Fanny Ann? I think, in our looking at the later census records, I'm more and more convinced that Fanny is Ann, but it's still a question mark. And when did Thomas die? That would be nice to know. And so we went to find a grave, and I looked for Anne. I found Anne, but more importantly, I found Charles. And notice that Charles was the son of Thomas and Anne with the right dates. Notice we have Thomas's death date in there. That's kind of fun. And he was 10 months old and 19 days when he died in 1875. So he died between the 1870 and 1880 census. He's at least the 3rd child of Thomas and Anne, of the possible 4. So there at least were 3. In Find a Grave, this is where I went first. We found in this grave site, I searched for all the Boston family. And so you find Anne, that's our Anne. You find Charles, one of the missing children. Fanny, who it says was born in 1868. So I'm more and more convinced that Fanny and Anne are the same person. There's a Robert that died in 1912. And by the way, he's 2 months old in 1912 when he dies. And Thomas, the father. So they're all buried in the same cemetery. Except for Fred, who must have moved on. And so here are the facts, ma'am. The 3rd child is Charles. At least I'm convinced. He was born in 1874 and died in 1875. Thomas died, if you go to the Find a Grave, you find out he died on March 20th, 1875, which we didn't know. We knew he died between 1870 and 1880. Fanny and Anne, I say unknown, but I'm convinced that they're the same. which means I'm not sure who the fourth child, we still don't know who the fourth child was. And that's a cold case. I'm just saying. But the real question is, who's Robert? So I'm going to give you a hint. I don't know this, but if you remember Fred's family and his two youngest children in 1920 were, oh, let's see what they were. Now I'm forgetting. Were 14 and 9. So there was a gap between the two youngest children. So it's very possible, that was in 1920. So it's very possible that Robert was a child of Fred that was born and died in 1912 at 2 months old. But we don't know. There's more to learn. Okay, I'm going to give you one last thing. Even something as simple as the race can be a very interesting part. Watching Finding My Roots on PBS, they did a study of the actor Ty Burrell, who's on Modern Family. And it turned out, he's a white actor, but it turned out that in his family lore, there was some hint of a black ancestor. And so if you went back, they went back in the census records and found in the 1900 census, his great-grandfather was listed as black, 1900. In 1910, by the way, he grew up in Oregon, which is interesting. In 1910, his great-grandfather was listed as mulatto. And in 1920, his great-grandfather was listed as white. So that proved to him that those family stories about having a black ancestor were probably true. And sure enough, they found on that TV show that he had the mother of his great-grandfather was a free person of color in Tennessee who left by herself, not with a husband, and went to Oregon and homesteaded in Oregon. And you can trace her path from Tennessee to Oregon by using the census record. And so he found out that it was true. He was born and raised in Oregon, but that he had this great story of a great great grandmother who had been a free person of color and gone out to Oregon by herself and homesteaded. Anyway, we're ready for you to go be detectives, and this is where the music would be da-dum, 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 da-dum. I've been told that some of the 1890 census survived, but I haven't seen them or anything. There is that veteran census in 1890 that did survive for many states that says something about whether the ancestor was had fought in the Civil War on the Union side. But I haven't seen any of the real one. Apparently some of it survived, but I haven't seen it. Okay, we're done here. Thanks, everybody. Those of you who are out there. Here we go. Can they hear it?